My name is Maya Chen, and until 3 months ago, I thought I was nobody special. Just another orphan who aged out of the system, working minimum wage jobs to survive in San Francisco. But sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor about revealing the truth. It was a Tuesday morning in March when my entire world shifted on its axis. I was eating generic cereal in my cramped studio apartment, half watching the morning news while getting ready for another mundane day fixing computers at a small tech repair shop. The volume was barely audible since my roommate Sarah was still sleeping, but something on the screen caught my attention. Technova Industries, the rise and tragedy of Silicon Valley's most mysterious family, the headline read. I grabbed the remote and turned up the volume, suddenly mesmerized by the documentary. Segment beginning to play, Robert Morrison appeared on screen, a distinguished man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and the kind of confident bearing that screamed old money. The narrator explained how he and his late wife Elizabeth had built Technova from a garage startup into a $40 billion empire that revolutionized cloud computing. But then the story took a dark turn. The Morrison family's greatest tragedy occurred 22 years ago, the narrator continued as old news footage filled the screen. On the night of March 15, 2002, a mysterious fire broke out in the maternity ward of St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco. In the chaos of evacuation, 3-month-old Emma Morrison, daughter of Robert and Elizabeth Morrison, vanished without a trace. My spoon froze halfway to my mouth. The date. March 15, 2002. The same date written on the back of the only photograph I'd ever had of my supposed mother. But it was what came next that made my blood run cold. The camera zoomed in on a hospital photo of baby Emma Morrison, and I was staring at myself. Not similar features, identical ones. The same unusual green eyes, the same small birthmark on the right temple, even the same distinctive cleft in the chin that I'd always been self-conscious about. Then they showed the necklace. My hand instinctively went to my throat, where I'd worn the same silver pendant every single day for as long as I could remember. The social workers at the orphanage said it was the only thing I had when I arrived as a baby, a unique piece of jewelry with an intricate tech-inspired design that looked like a circuit board formed into a flower. On screen, Elizabeth Morrison was wearing the exact same necklace in a family photo. The loss of Emma devastated the Morrison family, the documentary continued. Elizabeth Morrison never recovered from the grief and passed away 5 years later from what doctors called a broken heart. Robert Morrison withdrew from public life, and the family has maintained their privacy ever since, though they've never stopped searching for answers about what happened that night. I dropped my spoon, milk splashing across my laptop keyboard. Sarah stirred in her bed across the room, mumbling something about keeping it down, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. 22 years old. Check. Born March 15, 2002. Check. Found as a baby with no identification. Check. The necklace. The face, the birthmark. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and Googled Emma Morrison missing baby. Hundreds of articles appeared. Reward offers, age progression photos that looked exactly like me now, FBI investigations that went cold, a family's desperate search for their stolen daughter. This can't be real, I whispered to myself, but even as I said it, I knew it was. Every unexplained detail of my childhood suddenly made sense. Why I'd never looked like any of the other kids at the orphanage. Why I'd always had an inexplicable genius for technology that none of my caregivers could explain. Why I'd felt this constant, gnawing sense that I didn't belong where I was. I called in sick to work and spent the entire day researching everything I could find about the Morrison family. Robert Morrison, now 65, still lived in the family compound in Palo Alto. His sister-in-law, Victoria Morrison, had taken over day-to-day operations of Technova after Elizabeth's death. There were no other children, which meant if I really was Emma Morrison, I was the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar fortune. But more than the money, what made my chest tight with emotion was seeing photos of Elizabeth Morrison. She had my smile, my laugh lines. In video interviews, she gestured with her hands the same way I did when I got excited. I was looking at the mother I'd never known I'd lost. That night, I sat on my fire escape overlooking the foggy San Francisco streets, holding the photograph I'd treasured my entire life. The woman in the picture was Elizabeth Morrison, I was certain now. And the baby she was holding was me. I made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow I was going to Palo Alto, I was going to knock on the Morrison family's door and tell them I was their missing daughter. I was going home. If you've ever felt like you didn't belong where you were, like part of your identity was missing, leave a comment below. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and sometimes it takes 22 years to come to light. The Morrison estate in Palo Alto was everything I'd imagined and nothing I was prepared for. Driving my beat-up Honda Civic through the gated community, past manicured lawns and houses that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, I felt like an alien visiting another planet. The Morrison compound sat on 5 acres of prime Silicon Valley real estate, hidden behind tall gates and mature oak trees. The main house was a stunning blend of modern architecture and classic California design. All clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, and natural stone that probably cost more per square foot than I paid in rent for an entire year. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, gathering courage. What do you say when you knock on someone's door claiming to be their dead daughter? How do you explain 22 years of separation in a conversation? My palms were sweating as I finally walked up the stone pathway to the front entrance. The doorbell played a soft, expensive-sounding chime. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing a white cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her cold blue eyes looked me up and down with immediate disapproval. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that clearly indicated she had no intention of helping me with anything. "I'm looking for Robert Morrison," I said, my voice shakier than I'd hoped. "My name is Maya Chen, and I believe I'm his daughter. I think I'm Emma Morrison." The woman's expression shifted from annoyance to something approaching disgust. "Excuse me? I know how this sounds," I continued quickly, pulling out my phone to show her the comparison photos I'd made between myself and baby Emma. "But I have evidence. The timing, the location where I was found, this necklace—" "Victoria Morrison," she interrupted, not even glancing at my phone. "I'm Robert's sister-in-law, and I handle all inquiries regarding the family. And let me make something crystal clear to you, Miss Chen. My family has dealt with dozens of opportunistic fraudsters over the years, all claiming to be Emma. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Her words hit me like a slap. "I'm not a fraudster. I just want to know the truth about who I am." Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth? The truth is that you're a young woman who's done her research and thinks she can manipulate a grieving family for financial gain. The truth is that Emma Morrison died 22 years ago in that hospital fire, just like her mother died from the grief of losing her. But the necklace—" I started to lift the pendant from my chest. "Can be bought on eBay." Victoria cut me off sharply. "Do you have any idea how many people have shown up here over the years with that same necklace, claiming to be Emma? The hospital gift shop sold dozens of them. It means nothing." I felt my face burning with embarrassment and frustration. "Then let me take a DNA test. If I'm wrong, I'll leave and never bother your family again. But if I'm right—" "If you're right, you'll magically inherit $40 billion? Victoria's voice dripped with sarcasm. How convenient for someone living paycheck to paycheck as a computer repair technician. The fact that she already knew my occupation should have surprised me, but it didn't. Of course, they'd researched me the moment I'd made contact. Probably had a private investigator pull my entire life history within hours. "This isn't about money," I said, fighting back tears. "This is about finding my family. About knowing where I come from." "Your family," Victoria said, stepping closer and lowering her voice to a menacing whisper, "abandoned you at an orphanage because they didn't want you. That's your real story, Maya. Not some fairy tale about being a missing heiress." The cruelty of her words took my breath away. Before I could respond, a man in a dark suit appeared behind her, clearly security. "James will escort you off the property," Victoria said, her tone returning to businesslike coldness. "And let me be very clear about something. Miss Chen, if you contact our family again, if you speak to the media about this delusion, if you attempt to harass us in any way, we will pursue legal action for fraud and extortion. The Morrison family has resources you can't imagine, and we protect our interests aggressively. Please," I said desperately as the security guard took a step toward me. "Just ask Mr. Morrison to see me for 5 minutes. Let him look at me and tell me he doesn't see his daughter." Victoria's expression softened for just a moment, and I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even recognition. But it was gone in an instant. Robert Morrison, she said slowly, lost his wife and daughter 22 years ago. He's a broken man who's spent 2 decades clinging to hope that his child might still be alive. I will not allow some opportunistic stranger to reopen those wounds for her own profit. The security guard gently but firmly took my arm. Ma'am, I need to ask you to leave the property. As I was walked back to my car, Victoria called out one last time. Miss Chen, find a therapist to help you deal with whatever childhood trauma is driving this fantasy. But leave my family alone. I drove 3 blocks before I had to pull over and cry. Not just from the humiliation, but from the devastating realization that even if I was right, even if I was Emma Morrison, it didn't matter. Victoria Morrison had made it clear that I would never be welcomed into this family. They'd rather keep believing their daughter was dead than accept that she might have grown up poor and powerless. That night, I researched Victoria Morrison online, Elizabeth's older sister, who'd stepped in to help raise the family business after the tragedy. Never married, no children of her own, and by all accounts, fiercely protective of Robert Morrison and the family legacy, she also stood to lose everything if I really was Emma Morrison. As Elizabeth's sister, she likely inherited control of Elizabeth's share of the company when she died. If I was alive, that inheritance would belong to me instead. Victoria Morrison didn't just think I was a fraud. She needed me to be a fraud, and she had 40 billion reasons to make sure I stayed disappeared forever, but I wasn't giving up. Not when I was this close to the truth. I've always been stubborn, probably got that from the Morrison DNA. Instead of being defeated by Victoria's rejection, I became determined to prove my identity beyond any reasonable doubt. If they wanted evidence, I'd give them evidence. My first stop was St. Mary's Hospital, where I spent 3 days combing through archived records with the help of a sympathetic nurse named Patricia, who'd worked there for 30 years. She remembered the night of the fire, remembered the chaos, the confusion, the babies that were evacuated in the middle of the night. There was so much smoke and confusion, Patricia told me as we sat in the hospital cafeteria. The emergency lighting was down, and we were running on backup power. Babies were transferred to multiple hospitals across the city. Some records were damaged in the fire. She helped me track down the ambulance driver who'd transported several infants that night, a retired paramedic named Miguel Santos who now lived in Oakland. When I showed him my photo next to baby Emma Morrison's hospital picture, his eyes widened. I remember this case, he said slowly. 3 babies transferred to different hospitals. The Morrison baby was supposed to go to UCSF, but there was some last-minute change. Communication breakdown. She ended up at County General instead. County General Hospital, where their records showed a baby girl with no identification had been brought in that same night and later transferred to social services. A baby girl who became Maya Chen. I hired a genealogist named Dr. Sarah Kim with the last of my savings. Within a week, she'd traced my entire documented history and found the gaps that lined up perfectly with Emma Morrison's disappearance. Maya, Dr. Kim said when she called with her findings, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen a case with this many converging data points. The timeline, the location, the physical characteristics, even the way you were found, it all supports your theory. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source. I'd posted my story on several online forums for adopted children and missing persons, hoping to connect with others who might have information. That's how I found James Patterson. James was a retired San Francisco police detective who'd worked the Emma Morrison case in 2002. When he read my post, he reached out immediately. I always suspected something wasn't right about that night, he told me over coffee at a diner in the Mission District. The fire was ruled accidental, but there were inconsistencies. Security footage from the hospital had convenient gaps. Some of the staff stories didn't match up. He pulled out a thick folder he'd kept from the case, copies of reports, photographs, witness statements. The official story was that Emma Morrison died in the fire, but we never found a body. We never found any evidence that she'd actually died. She just vanished. Why wasn't this investigated further? I asked, flipping through reports that showed a frustratingly incomplete investigation. James looked uncomfortable. The Morrison family has a lot of influence in this city. After a few months, pressure came down from above to close the case. We were told to focus on other priorities. He pulled out a photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed the scene outside the hospital on the night of the fire, and there, in the background, barely visible in the crowd of onlookers, was a woman who looked exactly like Victoria Morrison. 22 years younger, but unmistakably her. I always wondered what Elizabeth's sister was doing at the hospital that night, James said quietly. The family said they were at home when they got the call about the fire. But this photo suggests otherwise. I stared at the image, pieces of a horrible puzzle beginning to click into place. You think Victoria was involved in my disappearance? I think, James said carefully, that someone wanted the Morrison heir to disappear that night. And I think they succeeded for 22 years. That evening, I called the Morrison house again, asking to speak directly to Robert Morrison. Victoria answered, her voice icy with recognition. I thought I made myself clear, Miss Chen. I have new evidence, I said. Police reports, hospital records, witness testimony. I know you were at the hospital that night, Victoria. I know you're the one who made sure I disappeared. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, harder, more dangerous. Prove it, she said simply, and the line went dead. The next morning, I woke up to find my car window smashed and my laptop stolen from inside. The police said it was probably random vandalism, but I knew better. Someone was trying to discourage me from digging deeper. That same day, I received a certified letter from Morrison Family Legal Group. Inside was a cease and desist order, threatening legal action if I continued to harass the family or make false claims about my identity. The letter also included a detailed list of my recent activities, where I'd been, who I'd spoken to, what evidence I'd gathered. They were watching me, but they'd made one crucial mistake. The letter was so specific about my investigation that it proved they were taking me seriously. Victoria Morrison wasn't just annoyed by a random fraud claim anymore. She was scared. That night, I made copies of everything, every document, every photo, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. I sent sets to Dr. Kim, James Patterson, and a safety deposit box at a bank across town. If something happened to me, the truth would still exist. I also did something that would either solve this mystery or put me in serious danger. I scheduled a DNA test, but not just any DNA test. Through Dr. Kim's connections, I'd arranged for a court-admissible paternity test with a lab that specialized in legal cases. If Robert Morrison was my father, this test would prove it beyond any scientific doubt. The only problem was getting Robert Morrison to agree to provide a DNA sample. And after weeks of Victoria blocking all contact with him, I was going to have to get creative. Very creative. I knew I had one chance to reach Robert Morrison directly, and it would have to be somewhere Victoria couldn't control the situation. After 3 weeks of surveillance, following the family's schedule from a distance, I discovered that Robert Morrison visited Elizabeth's grave every Sunday morning at exactly 9 a.m., always alone. Mountain View Cemetery was peaceful that Sunday morning, fog rolling through the oak trees as I waited behind a large headstone about 50 yards from Elizabeth Morrison's grave. At 9:02 a.m., a black Tesla pulled through the cemetery gates, and Robert Morrison stepped out. Seeing him in person took my breath away. Even at 65, the resemblance was unmistakable. We had the same nose, the same way of tilting our head when thinking. He moved with a quiet sadness that broke my heart, a man who'd spent 22 years carrying grief he might not have needed to bear. I waited until he'd been there for 10 minutes, letting him have his private moment with his wife before approaching slowly. He looked up as my footsteps crunched on the gravel path, and our eyes met for the first time. The effect was immediate and devastating. He went completely white, stumbling backward against Elizabeth's headstone. "No," he whispered. "This isn't possible. Mr. Morrison," I said gently, stopping about 10 feet away. "My name is Maya Chen, but I believe you knew me as Emma." He stared at me for a long moment, his hands shaking as they gripped the edge of the marble headstone. "You look just like her," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Just like Elizabeth when she was your age." "I know this is shocking," I said, pulling out the folder of evidence I'd brought. "But I have proof. DNA evidence, hospital records, witness testimony. I think I'm your daughter, Mr. Morrison. I think I've been alive all this time." Robert Morrison sank down onto the small bench beside his wife's grave, his face in his hands. "Victoria said you were a fraud. She said you were just another person trying to take advantage of our family." "Victoria lied to you," I said, sitting on the ground in front of him so we were at eye level. She's been lying to you for 22 years. I spent the next hour showing him everything. The hospital records that proved I'd been brought to County General the night of the fire. The ambulance driver's testimony about the mix-up in transfers. The photograph of Victoria at the hospital when she claimed to be at home. Dr. Kim's genealogical analysis. Detective Patterson's suspicions about the incomplete investigation. With each piece of evidence, Robert Morrison's expression shifted from disbelief to recognition to growing horror. She told me you were dead, he said, his voice breaking. After the fire, Victoria said they'd found She said they'd found remains. She organized the funeral. I buried an empty coffin, thinking it was my daughter. She needed everyone to believe I was dead, I explained gently. As long as you thought Emma died in the fire, Victoria maintained control of Elizabeth's share of the company. But if I came back, she'd lose everything, Robert finished, understanding washing over his features. Dear God, what did she do? What did my sister-in-law do to my child? That's when he noticed the necklace around my throat. With trembling hands, he reached out to touch the silver pendant, the same one Elizabeth had worn in every family photo. This was Elizabeth's, he said wonderingly. Her grandmother gave it to her when she graduated from Stanford. She never took it off, not even in the hospital when you were born. The nurses put it around your neck because Elizabeth insisted you should have it. Tears were streaming down both our faces now. I've worn it every day since I can remember, I whispered. It was the only thing I had from my mother. Robert Morrison looked into my eyes, green eyes just like his late wife's, and I saw the moment he truly recognized me. Not as a stranger claiming to be his daughter, but as the baby he'd lost 22 years ago. Emma, he breathed, and the way he said my real name felt like coming home. I want to do the DNA test, I said. Official, court admissible, so there's no question. But I already know what the results will show. So do I, he said, pulling me into the first hug I'd ever received from my father. I'm so sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner. We sat together beside my mother's grave for another hour, me telling him about growing up in the system, about the endless string of foster homes and group facilities, about working my way through community college and struggling to pay rent on a tech repair job. He told me about the 22 years he'd spent grieving, about the depression that nearly killed him after Elizabeth died, about how Victoria had stepped in to help the family and gradually taken more and more control. She's going to fight this, he warned me. Victoria doesn't give up power easily, and she has a lot to lose. Let her fight, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. I've been fighting my whole life. I'm not afraid of her anymore. We exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet with his lawyer the next day. But first, we were going to confront Victoria together. It was time for the truth to come out. As we walked back to our cars, Robert stopped suddenly. Emma, he said, there's something else you need to know. Something Victoria probably hasn't told you. My stomach clenched. What? The night you disappeared, Elizabeth didn't just lose her daughter. She was 8 weeks pregnant again. The stress of losing you caused her to miscarry a few days later. His voice was heavy with old grief. Victoria didn't just steal you from us. She destroyed our entire future family. The magnitude of Victoria's crime hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't just separated me from my parents. She'd killed my unborn sibling and my mother's will to live. She's going to pay for what she did, I said, my voice hard with determination. To all of us. Yes, Robert Morrison said, his eyes blazing with 22 years of misdirected grief finally finding its proper target. She is. The confrontation with Victoria Morrison happened 3 days later in the conference room of Morrison Family Legal Group, the same law firm that had sent me the cease and desist letter. Robert had insisted on neutral territory with witnesses present, knowing Victoria would try to manipulate the situation if they met privately. I arrived 15 minutes early with my lawyer, a fierce woman named Sandra Martinez, who specialized in family law and had agreed to take my case pro bono after reviewing the evidence. Robert was already there with his personal attorney, looking more determined than I'd ever seen him. When Victoria walked in at exactly 3 p.m., flanked by 2 lawyers and a private investigator, her confident demeanor faltered for just a moment when she saw Robert and me sitting together. But she recovered quickly, her face settling into the cold mask I was becoming familiar with. Robert, what is this about? She demanded, taking her seat across from us. I thought we'd agreed this fraud investigation was best left to the lawyers. The investigation is over, Victoria, Robert said quietly. I know the truth now. Victoria's lawyer, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit, leaned forward aggressively. Mr. Morrison, my client has prepared a comprehensive report debunking Ms. Chen's claims. We have evidence that she's perpetrated similar fraud attempts in other states. Stop, Robert interrupted, his voice carrying an authority I hadn't heard before. Just stop lying. He placed a manila envelope on the table between them. DNA results, he explained. Court admissible, performed by the same lab the FBI uses for paternity cases. 99.97% probability that Emma Morrison is my biological daughter. The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria went completely pale, her hands gripping the edge of the conference table. That's impossible, she whispered. What's impossible? Sandra Martinez said, opening her own folder. Is that Ms. Morrison convinced her brother-in-law to bury an empty coffin 22 years ago, while his living daughter was placed in the foster care system. She began laying out photographs, documents, and witness statements across the table like playing cards in a winning hand. Hospital records showing baby Emma Morrison was transferred to County General the night of the fire, not UCSF as the family was told. Ambulance driver testimony confirming the transfer mix-up. This security camera photograph showing Victoria Morrison at St. Mary's Hospital before the fire was even reported. Victoria's private investigator whispered something urgently in her ear, but she shook her head sharply. Her lawyer tried to interrupt, but Sandra continued methodically. Retired Detective James Patterson's witness statement detailing how the investigation was shut down after pressure from influential families. Financial records showing unusual payments from Morrison family accounts to various hospital staff members in the weeks following the fire. You paid them off, I said, my voice cutting through the lawyer's professional presentations. You paid hospital workers to lose the records, to claim I died in the fire, to make sure I disappeared forever. Victoria finally found her voice, but it came out as a croak. You don't understand. The company was everything to this family. Elizabeth was weak, emotional. She would have made terrible decisions if she'd lived. Someone had to protect the Morrison legacy. By murdering a baby? Robert's voice was deadly quiet. I didn't murder anyone, Victoria snapped, some of her old authority returning. I simply redirected her path. She was placed with a family who needed children. It was better for everyone. Better for you, I corrected. Because as long as everyone thought Emma Morrison was dead, you controlled Elizabeth's 40% of Technova Industries. Victoria's lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating his client's criminal exposure. Kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, falsifying death records. Victoria Morrison was looking at decades in federal prison, but I wasn't done. I pulled out one final piece of evidence that would destroy her completely. This is a letter, I said, holding up a handwritten note, written by Elizabeth Morrison to her daughter Emma on her first birthday. It was supposed to be put in a time capsule for me to read when I turned 18. I began reading aloud. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, it means you've grown into the beautiful young woman I always dreamed you'd become. I hope you know how much your father and I love you, and how proud we are of the person you've become. I've left instructions for you to inherit my share of Technova on your 21st birthday, because I want you to have the security to follow your dreams without ever having to depend on anyone else. Victoria lunged across the table, trying to grab the letter. That's private! You have no right— Actually, Sandra Martinez said calmly as Robert's lawyer restrained Victoria. As Emma Morrison's legal guardian, Ms. Chen has every right to her mother's correspondence. The letter continued with Elizabeth's hopes for my future, her instructions for the inheritance, and most damaging of all, her explicit concerns about Victoria's controlling behavior and her instructions that Victoria should have no role in my upbringing. Your own sister didn't trust you, I said to Victoria, who had collapsed back into her chair. She knew exactly what kind of person you were. That's when Victoria Morrison finally broke completely. 22 years of maintaining an elaborate lie, of pretending to grieve for a niece she'd essentially murdered, of watching Robert destroy himself with guilt. It all came pouring out in a confession that Sandra Martinez recorded on her phone. She was going to ruin everything. Victoria screamed, tears streaming down her face. Elizabeth was too soft, too emotional to run a company. She would have given it all away to charity or some stupid causes. Someone had to preserve what we'd built. So you staged the fire, I said, pieces clicking into place. You arranged for me to be transferred to a different hospital and then told everyone I died. It was supposed to be temporary, Victoria insisted desperately. I was going to bring you back when Elizabeth was stronger, when she could make rational decisions. But then she got pregnant again, and I couldn't let her replace you with another heir. The confession was damning enough to put Victoria away for life, but her next words revealed the true depth of her evil. I told Elizabeth that losing you made her a bad mother, that she couldn't protect her children. I convinced her the miscarriage was punishment for not being strong enough to save you. I made sure she never recovered from the grief because I needed her broken. Robert Morrison stood up so abruptly his chair fell over. For a moment, I thought he might attack his sister-in-law physically. Instead, he just looked at her with more disgust than I'd ever seen in another human being's eyes. You killed my wife, he said simply. You stole my daughter and you killed my wife. I saved this family. Victoria shrieked. I built Technova into what it is today. Without me, you would have lost everything. Without you, I said, standing to face the woman who'd stolen my childhood, I would have grown up with parents who loved me. My mother would still be alive. My baby brother or sister would be alive. You didn't save anything, Victoria. You destroyed everything. Sandra Martinez stood as well, gathering the evidence files. Ms. Morrison, you're looking at federal charges of kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to the wrongful death of Elizabeth Morrison. My advice would be to contact a criminal defense attorney immediately. Victoria's lawyers were already heading for the door, abandoning their client as the magnitude of her crimes became clear. She sat alone at the conference table, decades of lies finally catching up with her. As we prepared to leave, I turned back one more time. Victoria, there's one thing I want you to know. I forgive you. She looked up with something like hope in her eyes. Not for your sake, I continued.
For mine.
Because holding on to anger would make me like you, and I refuse to let what you did turn me into the kind of person who could hurt others. 6 months later, Victoria Morrison was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. The judge called her crimes a stunning betrayal, a family trust that destroyed multiple lives for personal gain. Robert and I used Elizabeth's letter to establish my legal identity as Emma Morrison and my rightful inheritance of her 40% of Technova Industries. But more important than the money was getting my father back. We're taking it slow, rebuilding a relationship that should have developed over 22 years. Some days are harder than others. There's a lot of grief to work through, a lot of lost time that can never be recovered. But we're family, and that means something powerful. I've started a foundation using part of my inheritance to help aged-out foster children transition to independence. Too many kids like me fall through the cracks of the system, and I want to make sure they have the support I never had. Robert and I visit Elizabeth's grave together every Sunday now, telling her about our week, about the foundation, about the life we're building from the ashes of Victoria's lies. I think she would be proud of who I became despite everything. The tech world has been fascinated by the story of the missing heiress who returned to claim her birthright. But honestly, the money never mattered to me. What mattered was learning that I wasn't abandoned or unwanted. I was stolen, and more importantly, I was loved. I am loved. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family that raises you, but that doesn't mean you stop belonging to them. DNA doesn't lie, and neither does love. It just sometimes takes 22 years to find its way home. If you're someone who's searching for your origins, who feels like you don't quite fit where you are, don't give up. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and sometimes the family you thought you'd lost has been looking for you all along. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, please share it with others who might need to hear that they're not alone in feeling lost. And remember, you're never too old to find your way home.